Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us for today's webinar. Today, we're going to look at a session involving the international standard ISO 20121, which is the Event Sustainability Management System standard. So we've decided to call this webinar Giving Your Events the Green Light. And I think we should take approximately maybe 30 to 40 minutes or so to run through everything. So hopefully you can all see my slides. I'll switch my webcam off whilst I run through them, and we'll get started now. Thanks for joining us again. So I'm Stephen Burt. What we'll run through today in terms of the agenda is firstly introductions to myself. We'll then have an overview of NQA sustainability services themselves. Then we'll work through the standard itself, ISO 20121, event sustainability. We'll have a think about what the benefits of it are, what the drivers for it are, and a little bit of detail around what the implementation of it looks like and the best ways to achieve the benefits from the implementation of the standard itself. We'll also have a look at how NQA can support you in achieving ISO 20121 certification. And lastly, at the end, we'll have some questions and answers. So hopefully you can see the questions box within the control panel. If you want to type in any questions as we go, then I'll happily answer those at the end, or if you prefer, please feel free to leave those until the end as well, and we can discuss them at that point. In order to post your questions, you'll need to type them into the questions box itself. So we won't be taking live audio for questions and answers, but certainly you can type them into the box. So a little bit of introductions first. So I'm Stephen Burt, I'm the field director here with NQA. I'm also one of our main auditors for our sustainability services. So I perform certification audits against ISO 20121, as well as the ISO standards for environmental management and energy management, and our carbon verification services, which is ISO 14064-1, and our carbon neutrality verification services, which is PAS 2060. So as well as looking after the auditors in NQA, I do quite a lot of sustainability auditing and sustainability verification myself. Amber Dixon is our Sustainability Assurance Manager. If any of you were interested in finding out any further information or going through the process of seeking a quote, then Amber would be the main contact for that. Just a very quick overview of NQA, who we are and what we do. So NQA are an accredited global certification body. So the organization's been around for more than 33 years, actually. It's more like 35 years or so. We operate in 90 countries around the world. We have over 1,000 employees throughout the world. And all in all, we have well over now actually 50,000 certificates in issue globally. Those certificates relate to lots of different ISO management system standards, as well as ISO 20121, which is obviously the focus of what we're looking at today. A little overview of our own sustainability services. So as is very common nowadays, we've gathered these under the headings ESG, environmental, social and governance. ISO 20121 is in there as a sustainable event standard, but it truly does cover all three of the ESG headings. In fact, ISO 20121, it's an older 2012 standard, so it refers to environmental, social and economic terminology rather than ESG terminology. But there's just a summary there of some of the different management system standard services that we provide for certification under the ESG headings and the sustainability umbrella overall. So an overview of ISO 21221 then. So this is what it looks like. I'm making the assumption that most of you, if not all of you in this call, are familiar with ISO standards and familiar to some extent with ISO standard terminology as well. So it's a British standard, it's an international standard. It was produced in 2012. It's a standard against which companies and organizations and even individuals can seek conformance and certification to when it comes to managing their event management services in a sustainable manner. So we'll go into a little bit more detail around exactly what that means shortly. The purpose of the standard is to provide the framework for improving the sustainability of events. So as I mentioned, it's applicable for organizations and individuals, which is unusual for an ISO standard. Usually they apply to organizations, but in this case, it can apply to organizations and individuals of all types and sizes. We'll see shortly that the structure of the standard ISO 21221 is organized around Annex SL. So hopefully that means something to you, but Annex SL is the common structure which almost all international standards, ISO standards, are structured around. There's a benefit to that. It means that it's easily integrated with existing ISO standards such as ISO 9001 for quality, or ISO 14001 for environmental, or ISO 45001 for health and safety. Same structure, so it's easily integrated. An event alone cannot claim to be compliant with the standard. It relates to the management system of the event or the events itself. So in keeping with all ISO standards of the nature that NQA are involved with, it's a management system standard itself. It doesn't apply to specific individual events, rather to the management system against which those events are organised. The claim of conformity to the standard has to reflect what the management system represents. So that can be a specific event if needed, or all events. And it covers and includes governing principles around sustainability topics. So as I mentioned previously, it uses the terminology environmental, social and economic issues, which are the three pillars of sustainability that you might be used to. And it's currently at the 2012 version. I noticed very recently, actually just last week, I think it was, BSI have requested interest in revising and updating the standard itself. So usually ISO updates standards every 10 years. So this one's slightly overdue, and it looks like they're about to go down the road of revising and updating it accordingly. Just some examples of organizations that operate event management systems that are certified to ISO 21221. So it's a fairly rapidly growing standard. It's getting recognized more and more. These aren't all NQA clients, I should point out, but these are some of the big names for events which are the event management systems are certified to ISO 21221. So you can see in there, for example, the Olympics, the World Athletics, the Commonwealth Games, some company-specific ones like Ferrari, the Yachting Global Solar Challenge, Renewable UK, which is a trade body for the renewable industry in the UK, and some venues as well. So Excel, you may be aware, is a very large events venue in London. So it applies as equally to venues as it does to organisations, as it does to events themselves as well. So some big names there that have already adopted it. So why do we need to think about sustainability improvement when it comes to events? Well, events actually have quite a significant impact, particularly from an environmental perspective, but also from a social and an economic perspective as well. So you can imagine from an environmental point of view, the waste, the transport, the travel, materials that are used. From a social awareness point of view, employment of people, local sourcing of materials, and the economic returns, for example, fair trade, or the economic impacts that large events have within the countries and the cities and the areas within which they're held. So, there's a high degree of positive as well as negative impacts which event management can have on sustainability, and this standard aims to address some of those and help to continually improve them. Interestingly, with this standard, as you might expect with event management, a lot of the sustainability issues arise through the supply chain itself. So every event that gets held, there's a high number of suppliers and contractors, venues, organisers that are involved in the process overall. So this standard focuses a high degree of effort on the supply chain, the tendering and the contract management processes, and that's because it's aimed at minimising the negative impacts of the products and services, minimising the demand for resources that arise as a result of holding events, and minimising the negative impacts on the supply chain itself, and in particular the social aspects. It also aims to ensure that fair contract terms are applied and respected throughout the supply chain. So it is focused significantly, and certainly in my experience of auditing organisations to achieve certification to this standard, a lot of effort is focused on the supply chain and the auditing of that supply chain itself. So in practice, the sustainability improvement initiatives that we might see taking place at events and being controlled using the ISO 20121 framework, they'll include improved planning for compliance with legal and other requirements. So, environmental, health and safety, social, legal requirements relating, the social ones might relate to discrimination, equality, accessibility, gender pay gaps, protected characteristics, and so on. So that's one thing that it's very focused on, is the legal compliance side of things. And as I mentioned previously, the supply chain management is the other primary focus for it. So when we get into the supply chain for events, when using ISO 20121, we can see the sustainability controls filtering through the contract and tendering process down the supply chain. So that includes lots of organisations. And when I do audits against this standard, I always take the opportunity to book time slots with each of the suppliers and the contractors, or each of the main suppliers and contractors to the event, to sit down and have a chat with them about what they have in place in order to achieve the event sustainability requirements. So that'll include things like the caterers, where they source the food from, how they dispose of the waste food, for example, the venue itself, where it sources its power supplies from, for example, some specifics around the carpets that are used in very big events, how those are reused or recycled at the end of the event, the stand shells, the banners, the graphics, how those are reused focusing on digital versus printed materials, suppliers for electrics and printing security. We'll talk to the transport and travel suppliers for public transport accessibility in relation to the event. Look at accommodation providers, look at the waste management contractors, and so on. Think about the health and safety controls during, stand and shell erection and dismantling works, and health and safety and social controls during the event itself. It also focuses, for obvious reasons, on communications with suppliers and delegates. So the process of implementing the management system that's in compliance with ISO 21221 very much focuses on the supply chain, and therefore when somebody like me comes along to audit the management system, a lot of time is spent sitting with the suppliers and the contractors and the delegates to the event and discussing with them and looking at the controls that they have in place. So given that ISO 21221 covers not only the event organisers, the supply chain and the stakeholders, there are other stakeholders who benefit from its application as well. So, the event organisers are an obvious one. Also the event owners, the workforce, the supply chain, the delegates, the participants, regulatory bodies and communities as well. So that the standard requires a high degree of engagement with the various stakeholders that are involved in the event management process. Some of the benefits of implementing the standard. We mentioned Annex SL previously, so it's structured so that it's easily adapted and integrated with other management system standards. It does give a really good process for identifying cost savings through improved efficiencies and performance. It makes things very transparent in terms of performance. It helps to identify areas of risk and to mitigate these, and overall to achieve continual improvement and improved social, economic and environmental results for the events themselves. So the framework itself, this little diagram gives quite a nice overview of the Plan, Do, Check, Act framework against which almost all ISO standards are organised. We'll work through these one by one, not in a huge amount of detail, but we will work through them one by one just to give you an overview of how it's structured and what the requirements within the standard itself are. So the screenshot on the right is taken from the standard itself. As you can see, it has 10 different clauses. As with all ISO standards, it's clause-based. Clauses 1, 2 and 3 we don't need to think about too much, although clause 3 gives some very useful terms and definitions around the terminology that's used within the standard itself. For those of you familiar with other ISO management system standards, clause 4 will be familiar, context of the organisation. So this is common across all of the ISO standards that are structured around Annex SL. So what it requires us to do is to determine what the external and internal issues and the related risks and opportunities around the event process are, to identify who the interested parties are, the stakeholders in other words, and what their needs and expectations of the event management process might be, to determine the scope of the management system itself, i.e. what it applies to, what the management system covers, to develop an event sustainability management system, which is often documented, so there are documented requirements within the standard itself. And lastly, within clause 4, to develop sustainable development principles, statement of purpose and values. So that usually includes providing a statement of the purpose and values that are involved, which are the organisation's governing principles of sustainability, sustainable development. And there should be, direct from the standard itself, considerations around stewardship, inclusivity, integrity and transparency within that statement of purpose and values. Clause 5 you'll be familiar with if you know ISO standards. So leadership, so the leadership and commitment clause is in there. The policy clause is in there in relation to a sustainable development policy, and the organisation roles, responsibilities and authorities clause is in there. In other words, we need to define those and communicate those throughout. Clause 6 is a planning clause in keeping with the Annex SL arrangements. So clause 6.1 is critical and key to the success of the management system. So it asks you to identify the risks and opportunities. It asks you to identify and evaluate the significance of sustainable development issues against the environmental, social and economic considerations. So this is similar. It's useful to think about this for those of you that are familiar with ISO 14001, Environmental Management System Standard. Similar process to identifying and evaluating the significance of environmental aspects, or for those that are familiar with ISO 45001, the Health and Safety Management System Standard, similar to identifying and evaluating hazards and risks. So we have a process here of identifying the sustainable development issues, documenting them, prioritising them, and then that feeds into the operational control arrangements for the management system itself. Clause 6.1, as well as asking us to conduct that process to identify the sustainable development issues, also asks us to identify and plan for relevant legal and other requirements. So those legal and other requirements will differ significantly country by country, region by region, overall, but we need to be thinking about environmental legal and other requirements, health and safety legal and other requirements, as well as social and economic legal and other requirements. So that then gets us into thinking about discrimination legal requirements, child labour legal requirements, anti-bribery legal requirements. So there's quite a lot to think about in terms of the legal and other requirements that need to be identified. Clause 6.2, straightforward enough. This is just about setting objectives for improvement for the events themselves and planning for how to go about achieving those. Clause 7 is identical to, or largely identical to, each of the other ISO standards that you might be familiar with. So provision of resources, provision of competent personnel to undertake the implementation of the management system, awareness raising and awareness levels, communication, both internal and external, including with delegates, and generating and controlling the documentation that's needed for the management system itself. Clause 8 is the operational planning and control clause. 8.1 is similar to the other ISO standards, so it requires us to take the sustainable development issues, which we've identified previously using the clause 6.1, and build those into perhaps documented procedures, perhaps undocumented procedures and processes to achieve the operational control levels that we need. Clause 8.2 is really about change management. So that's about dealing with modified activities, products or services that take place during or after the event management itself. And clause 8.3 is, to my mind, the critical, or one of the critical clauses. They're all critical, but one of the most important clauses is supply chain management. So This is critical because you need to include sufficient information in the tender process for suppliers and to be able to evaluate those suppliers to demonstrate their capability to support the event sustainability objectives. So that's about engaging fully with the supply chain. It's about writing tender documents to include sustainable development issues and controls. And in that way, it really leads the sustainability through the supply chain itself. And I've seen that really very effectively applied. And that is a critical piece for the success of the management system itself. Clause 9 you'll largely recognise from other ISO standards. So 9.1 is performance against governing principles of sustainable development. In other words, evaluating current and target performance against the statement of purpose and values that we discussed previously. 9.2 is the monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation. 9.3 is internal audit, 9.4 is management review. So we've seen certainly 9.2, 9.3 and 9.4. You'll be familiar with those from other standards. 9.1 is about evaluation against that initial statement of purpose and values itself. And this includes post-event as well. So after the event, it's a good idea to review the event itself and enable you to gauge performance against those purpose and values that have previously been established. And lastly, clause 10 is the improvement clause, again identical to the other ISO management systems. So identifying any non-conformities and taking corrective action to put them right. And lastly, the continual improvement in performance requirement that takes place. So those are the 10 clauses. You'll see lots and lots of similarities in there to other standards. The key ones that are different, I think, are the identification of the sustainable development issues, the prioritization, the evaluation of those to identify the significant ones, and also the supply chain management and the change management clauses are all unique, if you like, to ISO 21221 itself. So how can NQA support you in achieving certification to ISO 21221? So if you have a look on our sustainability microsite, you'll find lots of useful information there, not just relating to ISO 21221, but also to carbon and carbon neutrality verification, as well as to some other standards like ISO 26000, which is the social responsibility standard. So you'll find quite a few links in there, some blogs, some quick reads, some fact sheets. There's links to webinars which we've previously undertaken against other standards that we would term sustainability standards. There's some case studies, and there's also a link to our associate partner program. The APP, or the Associate Partner Programme, contains information on consultants who, if your organisation wishes to find a consultant who can help with ISO 21221, then we have some good relationships with some of them. I'd be more than happy to recommend somebody that could help you to do the implementation. We can also assist with training. So again, on our sustainability microsite, you will find links to various training courses around greenhouse gas and carbon neutrality and various other things. But included in there as well as an e-learning introduction training session for ISO 21221. It's combined, it's bundled together with ISO 26000, the social responsibility standard. But if that was of any interest to you, you can access that immediately via our website. And lastly, the certification process itself. So if anybody was interested, then making contact at an early stage is a good idea. We can talk you through the process from start to finish. But essentially, if you did wish to speak to myself or one of my colleagues, we can provide you with a quote request form. We then book the certification audit itself. Typically, it's, well, not typically, but it is undertaken as a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit. The stage 1 audit being preparedness audit to make sure the management system is designed in conformance with the standard itself, ISO 21221. And then the stage 2 audit is the implementation of the standard itself. And whenever I've done a stage 2 certification audit for ISO 21221, I've gone to an event and I've audited the people, the organization itself at the event, the venue providers, the catering providers, the audio visual equipment providers, the stand and banner providers, all of the suppliers that are at the event itself, as well as the delegates, spoken with the delegates. So that's quite an important, not an essential, but an important part of the stage 2, if possible, to actually go to one of the large events that are controlled by the management system and assess the implementation of the management system partly through that process. So that gives us a fairly brief overview of ISO 21221 and some of the benefits of it and some of the techniques for implementation. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to enter them into the question box now, and I'll be more than happy to take them. So we've got one question from Brendan. Thank you, Brendan. Hello, nice to see you. Brendan's asking, given the complexity of the standard and the need to check a range of legal compliance issues, who does the internal audits? So usually, internal audits, as with all ISO standards, can be done by somebody internal to the organization who is competent to do so. In other words, trained or experienced to be able to do that. Some organizations will use a consultant to undertake the internal audits as well. So there are consultants out there. I've worked with 2 or 3 over the years who have the necessary expertise for ISO 21221, and they can help with the internal audit process or the system design if that would be useful. So Brendan, if you need any guidance on that, feel free and I can point you in the right direction. Chris, thank you for your comment. That's very good. Any further questions? If anybody has anything else would like to put it in. So Kuram has asked, if I can just, can the internal audits be done by auditors who are trained with other standards? Yes, I think so. I mean, internal auditing as a principle is the skills needed for internal auditing are similar across all standards. In an ideal situation, they would be trained as an ISO 21221 auditor, but there's a shortage of internal auditor training courses. So it's somebody who has the necessary skills and critically the necessary knowledge of the ISO 21221 standard could be used to do that. Kuram, certainly. Senim is asking, will you share the presentation with us? Yes, I think that will be sent out by NQA training following this session, so you'll have the materials to hand. Lorraine's asked, we already have ISO 9001 and 14001. How do we go about implementing this as part of our BMS and into our NQA assessments? So the Annex SL structure, Lorraine, makes it an easy standard to integrate into your existing standard structure. First thing to do is to buy a copy of the standard. You can buy that from ISO themselves or from BSI as well, and have a read through, and you'll see where the similarities are. There's lots and lots of similarities. The key differences, as discussed earlier on, around the sustainable development issue identification and the legal and other requirements, because you're looking at much more than just environment, health and safety as well, and the social type legal requirements and economic ones as well. And the change management process and the supply chain processes. Those are the kind of standout unique clauses to ISO 21221. So Lorraine, first step is to get a copy of the standard and have a read through yourself. If you've got the internal capability, then it's something you could do yourself, or you could engage a consultant to help you. And in terms of integrating them into our NQA assessments, we could have a chat later on, Lorraine, but first thing to do is ask us for a quote request form if that was something that you wanted to do, or go to our microsite and have a look at the information that we have there that might help with that. Any last questions before we finish up? Oh, you're welcome, Lorraine, thanks. Good. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions for now. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time to listen to me this afternoon. And if there's anything that I can help with, you can see on the screen, my email address is there. Feel free to drop me a note and I'll be very happy to help if I can. And thanks again for attending, everybody. Thank you very much. Goodbye.